So performance measures and culture, two things that don't necessarily seem like they go together, but they really do. You know, the things you're going to be tracking in the different systems that we have, they all come from, you know, a program that's solid and has a really good culture. So we're going to kind of talk about them together. There are also two things that everybody needs to be involved with. So maybe you're not the person who enters information into DYB, but you probably have some sort of role when it comes to the data that your program is reporting. Same thing with culture. You may not be the director of your program, but we all have a part to play in making sure we're setting the right tone for our young people. So in the next hour, we're going to talk about data culture and how that demonstrates impact, not just to funders, but, you know, to us, to the network, to different stakeholders. We're also going to talk how we measure the impact of Youth Build AmeriCorps and your responsibilities in that reporting. And then, yeah, definitely understanding the importance of source documentation and being able to back up those numbers with records at the program. And then we're going to talk a little bit at the end about a culture of service. That's a talk that we usually reserve for brand new programs. A lot of you guys are coming from existing programs, but it doesn't hurt to preach to the choir every once in a while.
Like Matt said, I'm going to be talking about data for a little while, specifically performance measures as it relates to our AmeriCorps grant, reporting those in DYB, and also all of the documentation that has to go along with this. So the main system that we're going to be talking about doing all of this reporting in this section is going to be DYB. We've mentioned it a few times in the past few sessions, but in this session, we're really going to dive into DYB. So this is Youth Build's data system. We've talked a lot about eGrants, which is the system that AmeriCorps really owns and controls. But this is Youth Build's data system. It's important to understand that, unfortunately, DYB cannot be linked to eGrants. Same with MIS, right? If you're a DOL grantee, we know you're also using MIS. These systems can't talk to each other. And we do want to recognize that it probably means you're going to be entering some data into DYB that you've already entered into these two systems. We wish we could change that for you, but we can't. It's just the way it is. So what types of things are you going to be entering into DYB as it relates to your AmeriCorps grant? The first thing you're going to be doing is, this is where you're going to set all of your objectives for your AmeriCorps performance measures. And then on a quarterly basis throughout the year, you're going to be reporting on your progress towards meeting those objectives. You're also going to set the expected start dates for each of your AmeriCorps cohorts in DYB, as well as managing member enrollments in AmeriCorps. So you will actually assign your Youth Build members who are entered into DYB in AmeriCorps slot, and you will track their progress, meaning their hours, towards earning their education award. Additionally, at the end, you'll report on whether or not they earned that education award or not. Okay, so again, the great thing about DYB is that this is Youth Build's data system. So we have a team right at Youth Build USA, we call them the DYB support team, that's available to help you with any technical issues or training that you might need. So you don't necessarily have to copy this information right off of the slide. Anytime you're logged into DYB, you can scroll to the bottom of any page that you're on, and this contact info is there for you. So anytime you have a question or you feel like you're experiencing a technical issue, you can always get on the phone with the DYB support team. And those are our coworkers right in our Youth Build USA office. They're fantastic, and they're a great resource for you guys to know about. Quick snapshot of what DYB looks like for those of you who have not been in it before or who are really new to the system. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is where you navigate through DYB. And right now, I'm clicked into the AmeriCorps Grant Reports section, which you will all have since you're AmeriCorps grantees. This is just a quick snapshot of one section of the AmeriCorps Grant Report. This is the section that has to do with our community impact measures having to do with housing units. The important thing to realize, most of DYB pages will look the same. You're going to have two columns, an objectives column and the actual column. The objective you set. It's up to you at your program to set your own objectives. We don't set those for you. It's really up to you. Once you set those at the beginning of a grant year, you will continue to update your progress towards those objectives in this actual column here. But everything that goes into this column also needs to be documented, and that's what I'm going to be talking about throughout this presentation. So we're going to start with just some core data principles. The first one is to set the expectation that we want to make sure all of the data that you're putting into DYB is good data. It's better to not report anything than to report something inaccurately. So if you're unclear about something, confused, or you don't understand a particular performance measure you're being asked to report about, ask us before just throwing a number in there. Okay, because we really want you to understand that bad data or inaccurate data is really a contamination to the whole network. So what's important to understand here, we ask you to report on all of these performance measures because then it's our responsibility to pull that all together and report up to CNCS on behalf of the whole network what our collective impact has been. So when you drop your numbers into DYB, it's a drop in the bucket for the whole network. And we want to make sure that everyone's data that you're putting in is completely accurate before you enter it. Every number that is reported, everything that you enter into DYB, it needs to have verification documentation along with it. So this is a repetition of everything we said about our member files, right? And all of that paperwork. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen. The same rules apply to our performance measures. Everything you enter into DYB needs to have backup documentation to verify that it's accurate. So we don't want you guessing or estimating at anything. If there's a form that needs a signature, make sure it's signed. Everything has a document to go along with it. And I will, of course, be walking you through all of them. All right, so we're going to pause and talk a little bit first about setting those objectives. I said it's up to you to set your own objectives. So to introduce this, we often like to say, you know, there's this motivational saying that a lot of people have seen probably, shoot for the moon, and even if you miss, you'll land among the stars. It's really inspirational, right? Set your objectives really high, stretch yourself. Unfortunately, it's not actually great life advice. This is really just a recipe for how to die horribly in space. Now, obviously we're being a little facetious here, but the point that we're trying to make is that we don't want you to just go in and set incredibly high objectives. We don't want you to go in and say that every single percentage mark is going to be 100%, when that's not actually accurate or even maybe possible for your program. We want you to set reasonable objectives. And if you're brand new to your program and you're being put in charge of setting objectives in DYB for the next grant year, the best thing to do is to go back through your previous AmeriCorps grant reports to see what your program's performance has been and set your new objectives based on those. So this is another shared language image that you've seen a few of them pop up in our presentations so far this week. This is our AmeriCorps impact triangle. We're talking about understanding your impact on the community, on your program, and on your members. That's what this image represents. So again, we want you to know and understand the objectives that you're setting, and we want you to have all of the right systems for tracking and documenting what goes into DYB in each of these three categories. And really what we want you to walk away understanding is that it's not just numbers that we're asking you to throw into another data system. All of this data really tells the story of the positive impact you're having in these three categories. And it's data that you can use to tell your story with your own funders, just like we tell it, we use it to tell our story with our primary funder, CNCS. All right, so what I'm going to do next is dive into each of these three categories, starting with community impact. So when we're talking about the impact that we're having on our community, the main pieces of data that we're asking you for in DYB are around your primary service activities, okay? So first I'm going to start with construction service tracks because everyone has these. I am also going to touch on non-construction service tracks after this, but let's start with construction. Every one of you has these performance measures being asked of you in your AmeriCorps grant report. The number of housing units that you have developed, the number of housing units that you have repaired, the number of housing units that you have made safer, and then the number of Youth Build AmeriCorps members that worked on these units. Okay, so these are the performance measures that we're tracking in our community impact section. But we know a lot of you now are running non-construction service tracks. This has really expanded in the last year or two in our network, and so many of you are at programs that are already running one, if not more, of the non-construction service tracks that you can see listed here. This is the list of all of the possible non-construction service tracks that are currently being run. When it comes to tracking performance measures in these non-construction service tracks, we need you to develop your own performance measures. Okay, we don't have set in stone standard performance measures for each of these. It's up to you to set your own, and I'm going to walk through a little bit how to do that. And just for anybody who's brand new here, do know that these are all pre-approved tracks. Programs have to apply for these with an application, be vetted, sometimes go through a trial period, and be pre-approved to run these tracks. So just to make sure that's really clear. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how we would plan for performance measures for a non-construction service track. Again, we're asking you to set your own performance measures, just like in the construction tracks, you're tracking housing that's being given to you. I thought what would be helpful is actually to use construction as an example for a quick little sort of thought process for how to get towards planning a performance measure. And it's basically going through how to design a new program, right? So first what you do is you identify the unmet community need that you are addressing in this track. For instance, in construction, since we're all familiar with that, we are talking about a lack of safe, affordable housing for low-income members of our community, right? That's what we're addressing in these AmeriCorps service tracks. Therefore, the service activities that we plan for our young people is we train them in construction skills, and they help to develop or repair low-income housing for their communities. Which is why then the performance measures that we set are to track how many housing units you've developed or repaired. So hopefully that also gives a little context for why you're reporting on those performance measures for the construction track in DYB, right? It's telling the story about how you're impacting the unmet community need. We want you to use this same framework for you to decide what your performance measures should be if you're running a non-construction service track. I'm going to use community health and wellness as an example and just go through two examples. The reason why you're all being asked to set your own performance measures here is because two community health and wellness tracks could look very different from each other. That's true for almost all of our non-construction service tracks, so there's no way of setting one standard performance measure for all of you. So let's say somebody's running a community health and wellness track where they've identified the community need as a lack of quality healthcare services for low-income residents. In that track, at that program, you may have your community health and wellness AmeriCorps members assisting nursing staff at a community health clinic and supporting patients. So maybe it would make sense in this track to be able to document the number of community residents that you're serving, that your members are serving at this community health clinic. But maybe at another site that is also running a community health and wellness track, they're actually really addressing the fact that there's a lack of public health resources in their community. So the activities that they have their AmeriCorps members doing are providing public health resources and workshops in either community centers or senior centers in their neighborhoods. So it might make more sense at this program to track the number of training sessions provided to community residents or the number of resources developed. So these would be the performance measures that you're setting. Same thought process for all of the non-construction service tracks. So now that we have established what performance measures we're tracking or how to create your own performance measures, I'm going to transition into talking about how to document all of this. And again, we'll start with construction because this is the one that everyone is doing. So there's two forms to use to document the construction performance measures that you're reporting on in DYB. Again, remember, every number you enter into DYB needs to have some backup documentation at your site. And what I'll do is I'll pause for a minute and just introduce also a best practice that we like to suggest, which is having a separate binder at your program site specifically for AmeriCorps performance measures, okay? So a binder with different sections for all of the different categories that I'm going to introduce here, where you can keep all of these forms. And that way it's organized and you have all of your backup documentation for your DYB reporting in one place. Every form that I'm going to show you is available for you guys to download right on our website. So every housing unit that you're going to report on in DYB needs a housing unit tracking form. That's the form that you see right in the center of your screen here. There's a place right at the top for you to enter the address of the housing unit and then qualify the type of work that you're doing on it, the dates that you worked on it. So every housing unit that you work on needs this form. It also needs some sort of extra backup documentation. So while you're writing the address on this form and saying that your crew worked on this house, you need some sort of extra documentation, like a permit that was pulled to do work on the house, or a certificate of occupancy or an inspection report. Something that has that address with a date that correlates to when you're saying the work was done. This could be complicated to get, and I would say if you have questions about how to acquire that type of backup documentation, talk to your portfolio manager and we can talk through different options for how to get that documentation. But do know we need both this form and that extra level of documentation. The extra form that you see over here on the right is a summary page. So you would be able to list out each address that you worked on. So for every housing unit tracking form that you have in your binder, for each grant year, you could list them out on this tracking summary form. And then the totals down here are what you end up putting in DYB. This might not always be necessary. I know there's some programs I have in my portfolio that only have 1 or 2 houses that they develop each year, right? But if you're a program that has a lot of housing units that you're either developing or repairing each year, the summary form could get really helpful for you. The important thing to understand why we're doing all of this, every individual housing unit can only ever be put into DYB and counted one time. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing all of this checking and documentation. If you work on one housing unit over the course of 2 grant years, you can only ever count that house one time. Usually when you complete it, the grant year in which you complete the house would be when you would count it. It's really up to you though, as long as you only count it once. So that's how we're documenting our construction performance measures. But I went through that exercise about the fact that you need to set your own performance measures if you have non-construction service tracks at your program. This is the documentation for those tracks, okay? It's a little bit more low tech because we don't actually have the ability to customize creating new fields for you in DYB. So you're not actually going to be reporting on your performance measures for non-construction tracks in DYB. You're going to use this Excel sheet instead. So your portfolio manager would email this to you. You would only use the sections, obviously, for the tracks that you are currently running at your program. In each section, there is one set performance measure. We ask you to tell us the number of Youth Build AmeriCorps members that were in that track. And then we ask you to set at least one additional performance measure for each non-construction track that you are running. And then you can see over here, it looks similar to DYB. We ask you to set objectives at the beginning of the grant year and then report back at the end of the grant year the actual number. One last point about this, and we would talk to you about this one-on-one as portfolio managers with you, but we want to make sure that when you're developing these performance measures for your non-construction tracks, you're also planning for what your backup documentation would be for these data points, right? So if you're going to track the number of community residents that you served at a community health clinic, you need some sort of documentation, probably from your community partner, right? That shows maybe on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, a count of how many patients your members help to support. So planning for that backup documentation as you're planning your performance measures will be really important. And again, use your portfolio managers to have those conversations and help think that through. All right. So with that, let's move into the next big category, which is program impact. When we're talking about and measuring the impact on the program, this is the category of data points we're looking at in DYB. your non-AmeriCorps volunteers that you are recruiting. So there's three data points in DYB that we're looking at. The number of episodic non-AmeriCorps volunteers that you recruited, the number of recurring non-AmeriCorps volunteers that you recruited, and then the total number of non-AmeriCorps volunteer hours that you generated. So obviously we need to dive into what is episodic and what is recurring. So episodic are your one-time volunteers. Maybe you organize a big community service day, a big MLK day, and you recruit community volunteers to come and volunteer alongside your members on that day. And that's how that person interacts with your program. That would be an episodic volunteer. Recurring volunteers are both anticipated and ongoing throughout a grant year. So a good example of a recurring volunteer might be a tutor. Maybe you have a retired school teacher who comes in and volunteers their time helping to tutor your young people. And they come in on a weekly basis, or somebody who provides a workshop multiple times throughout a grant year, right? Those would be recurring volunteers. And the data point at the end is just to remind you about the dates of our grant year, right? So our grant years start on August 15th and end on August 14th the following year. So we're always making sure that the data points that we're capturing, so the number of AmeriCorps volunteers that we're counting, are the volunteers that engaged with your program between those dates. All right, so how are we documenting volunteers? Two different forms here. One is for episodic volunteers and one is for recurring. So the one on the left, more in the center of the screen, is what we would use to document episodic volunteers. It's essentially a volunteer sign-in sheet. So when you have those big service days, remembering to grab one of these sign-in sheets, bring it with you so that your non-AmeriCorps, non-staff, right, community volunteers can sign in. There's a time in and time out, because remember, you need to report on hours as well. And you can use these volunteer sign-in sheets to track your episodic volunteers throughout the grant year. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see the tracking form for recurring non-AmeriCorps volunteers. So in this case, each recurring volunteer gets their own page. So you put their name up here and the nature in which they're volunteering. Again, if they're a tutor, providing a workshop, whatever it may be. And then you enter each date that they come into the program and the hours they spend there. So this is the way that you keep track of all of the hours that a recurring volunteer gives you throughout a grant year. And again, it's great to keep this in the same binder I was talking about before. Have one binder for all your AmeriCorps performance measures. Now you just have a section for volunteers, right? To keep everything in the same place. Quick reminder, we talked about this yesterday in timekeeping. Volunteers are subject to the same rules regarding prohibited activities as AmeriCorps members if the program is counting their numbers and hours towards their project goals or performance measures. So you have to think about that. If you're having some sort of service day or youth build day that involves prohibited activities, you don't want to count those individuals then that are taking part in that day as AmeriCorps or as non-AmeriCorps volunteers on an AmeriCorps sign-in sheet. Right, so always think about if it's a youth build time activity, not an AmeriTime activity, then don't count those hours on any of these sheets. Okay. One other tool to use when you are ready to put your non-AmeriCorps volunteer data into DYB. This is an Excel document. And when you open this Excel document, there's 3 tabs. So right now you're looking at all 3 tabs at once. So one tab is for recurring non-AmeriCorps volunteers. One tab is for episodic non-AmeriCorps volunteers. And the third tab is your summary tab. So it's just your opportunity to go through all of those sort of sign-in sheets and recurring volunteer forms that you have in that binder. Come in here, enter all of the information that you've collected on those forms, and it will automatically tally for you the numbers to put into DYB. Another great feature to use this tool for is it's going to alert you to if you have double counted an individual. Same rule applies here as housing units. We can only ever count an individual person once, right? Because we have to make sure that the number of volunteers that we're reporting to CNCS is true and accurate. So using this tool will help you determine if you have accidentally double counted someone. So the last category is our member impact category. Right, so these are the types of data that we collect in DYB that have to do with member impact. The biggest one as it relates to our AmeriCorps work is that first bullet point, the education award attainment. So whether or not the individuals are earning the education award at the end of their term of service. You'll hear us talk about Ed Award attainment rates a lot in our network. We'll talk about it on conference calls. Sometimes we even have awards for the program who has the highest Ed Award attainment rate, right? That's a data point that we look at in DYB a lot. Also important across all aspects of the Youth Build program, right, are the GED or high school diploma attainment as well as job placement. So it's important to think about the fact that for each of these data points in DYB, you also want to make sure that you have the proper source documentation at your site. These are a little bit more straightforward. I don't have to introduce any new forms to you for these because they're sort of built into the process. When talking about education awards, your source documentation essentially are your member hour logs, the fact that you did the exit officially in eGrant, or any of that exit paperwork that you guys just learned about in the last session, right? Exits are generally documented very efficiently with all of our member file paperwork. It is a good opportunity for me to just remind you, though, that we always want the final hour report in DYB for each member to match the member hour logs and the number of hours that are in eGrants. Right? It's something that we always check if we come out on site visits. When you exit somebody from DYB, you need to finish reporting on their hours, tell us whether or not they earned an Ed Award. We want that number of hours to match what you had written into eGrants and what the member hour logs in the member files say. But those member hour logs really are your source documentation for Ed Award attainment. And then again, with GED or high school diploma, obviously keeping a copy of that document in the member file, and with job placements, an offer letter, pay stub, or letter from employer, particularly as it relates to AmeriCorps, if you exited somebody for employment, you're collecting that type of documentation also, and it's already in the member file. So that was a lot of information to take in, and we always want to point you to the different resources that we have. This in particular is our performance measures and reporting manual. Everything that I just said is written in this manual with links to all of the different forms. So it's a really helpful tool if you're somebody who learns better by reading a manual and reading through everything you just heard me say. Go check that out on our website. It could be really helpful.
We're going to talk a little bit about a culture of service. So all that stuff that Lauren just talked about, you know, it's not just one person's job, right? Whether you're the person out on the service site that's helping to document what's going on, or you know, you're filling in some of these tools to help communicate that to whoever it is that's reporting. I mean, it really is a shared responsibility, and so is a culture of service. You know, again, this is really part of a talk that we do for brand new programs, and a lot of you guys come from established programs, but it doesn't hurt to revisit every once in a while, because again, this is something that isn't just left up to a director or, you know, leadership at a program. It really is everybody's job. So we wanted to talk a little bit about not only the culture, but the other things that AmeriCorps can bring to your site outside of operating money and a chance for a scholarship. I believe wholeheartedly, and I've been doing this for over 2 decades, is that, you know, AmeriCorps is really part of the culture of a youth build program. Yeah, you know, we say it's in our DNA, and it really is. You know, when you go back to the 70s, when Dorothy Stoneman sat down with her students in East Harlem, you know, she said, hey, if I can get some resources into this community, what would you guys do? And those young people chose service, right? So service and community connection and our young people showing their leadership in their neighborhood, that's really central to what we're doing. So, you know, when you start to bring on service or bring on AmeriCorps to your program. It's really not an add-on. It's really just amplifying what's already there and frankly doing it right. So yeah, I mean, we go out to sites all the time. We interact with programs all the time. And, you know, we ask about the culture from the staff and we ask from members. We always hear that, you know, it's a family culture or it's a supportive culture. And that's great. But, you know, that takes intentionality and it takes some forethought. So when we teach programs about how to build their culture, how to really shore up a strong culture, we think about it in terms of these 5 steps. And we're going to go through them now and show some examples of how programs are doing it well. So first off, you have to have a plan. You know, again, we hear from young people all the time, oh, my program is so supportive. Oh, I feel like I'm part of a family. And that's really part of the special sauce of Youth Build. You know, a lot of times that's not something that our young people will have experienced in their life. So providing that is important. But having a written down plan, a mission statement, or something like that, that really defines your approach. We all have a shared model, but each program is independent and has their own way of doing things. And a lot of times that culture or that mission is centered around one, you know, strong individual. And whether that individual retires or, you know, transfers out to other employment, a lot of that can be lost if that person leaves. So I think, you know, again, when you go to put your culture together and put your tone together, writing it down is so important. And then secondly, getting everyone on board. You know, we talk about this a lot when it comes to young people, you know, during a mental toughness orientation, for example, like really trying to get them to understand the tone of what we're trying to do and, you know, the culture we're trying to set, but also your staff too. I mean, you know, part of your orientation for new staff members should be some explanation of your approach, your individual approach as a program. Because again, you know, we may say that we're about love and accountability and respect, but what does that really mean to us? And if I ask the young people what it means, are they going to say something different than what a staff person would say? So again, you know, whether it's making sure that your staff are part of that mental toughness orientation each year or doing a mental toughness for your staff. And that's something they do really well at Youth Build Philadelphia Charter School. They do a staff mental toughness every summer before the school year starts to, you know, orient new staff, but also to have existing staff reconnect to the mission. And I think that's really important. We try to do that at Youth Build USA too, because you can get caught up in your day-to-day work and forget what, you know, it's all about. Another great way of making sure that everybody has the same definitions in place is to make those values or that mission conspicuous. So one thing they do at the Seat Center here in Schenectady, New York, is they take their values, their 5 stated values, and they've made these giant posters that they hang in the great room. Not only with the value, but also the Seat Center Youth Build Schenectady definition of what integrity or ownership means to them. And, you know, people pass by this 4 or 5 times a day and you almost absorb it by osmosis. So again, just a cool program example that I've seen over the years. And then, you know, when we're talking about service, and again, I do believe that service is central to the DNA of Youth Build, we need to take a little time to redefine the expectations of our young people. You know, a lot of times young people will come to our program with a certain definition in their head of community service, right? And it's part of our job to change that definition. Mandated community service, some sort of punishment, just some sort of task you're making me do because you have to keep me busy each day. Some requirement because it's part of your programming, not necessarily what I came here to do. maybe I'm just cheap labor in the community. And that's one of the reasons we talk a lot about making sure we're not displacing workers in the community with this giant workforce of servants, right? Because we don't want our young people to just be cheap labor. And maybe it's boring. And frankly, maybe it is. You know, if you haven't taken the time to provide context and create areas for reflection on the things that we're doing, yeah, it could be boring. But yeah, so we flipped the script on service and we talked to young people about some of the positive things that can go along with it. So again, a lot of you guys are coming from established programs. This isn't anything new. So what are some of the things that you tell your students, either during mental toughness or in the lead up to a service project, to get them excited about the term service? What are some of the ways that we can refer to service in a positive way? Empowered to make a positive change and contribute to my community, connect to the community. Something I want to do. Again, we meet a lot of alumni that really got excited about service because of their experience in Youth Build. I think when we can create that, that's a really special thing. Leadership opportunities, absolutely. Service should be built into your leadership development time. That definitely makes sense. Learning how to address community needs, planning and implementation skills. So a lot of that goes along with service learning. And we're going to be talking a lot about service learning next week. So yeah, that's a great one too. Skill and career development. It's a great way to try out different fields, right? During my term of service, I planted trees, I did community gardens, we worked at food banks, we did all sorts of things, and I got to be exposed to a lot of different career paths, and I chose grant management. So yeah, that's definitely one as well. And then meeting new people in the community, again, building that social capital. And it's fun. Sometimes it's a lot of fun. So some of the things that programs are doing to connect their young people to service is connecting them to the greater service movement, right? We're not the only AmeriCorps program. There could be other AmeriCorps programs right in your city. And a big part of that is being conspicuous with it. Let's wear the logo. Let's have the logo up and around our program facility to really connect them to, you know, we're part of this Youth Build movement, but Youth Build is also a part of this greater national service movement where together we're all getting a lot of really great things done. And that identity is a big part of it. So we send you stuff every fall. This fall will be no different. You know, we usually send out site signs like what you're seeing down here. We send out a t-shirt that has the Youth Build and AmeriCorps logos on them. We can also share a number of different camera-ready logos for you to bring to a printer to create your own uniforms and service gear. There's also a couple different sites, and maybe our assistants could link some of them in the chat. There's gooddeed.org and nationalservicegear.org, where you can order a lot of different AmeriCorps items with the logos and slogans and all of that. So definitely worth doing because we want our young people to identify with national service. A really great thing that they do at Building Futures Youth Build in Godfrey, Illinois, and as part of the construction training, the young people, they make their own AmeriCorps signage. And as one of the last things they do in the carpentry section of their NCCR training. And yeah, you walk around their program facility and some of them are just gorgeous and they've been around for years. And I think that's a really great best practice that we get to see every now and again. The other way is recognizing members. So Lauren talked a lot about how we're documenting the accomplishments of our members for our reporting, but also making it conspicuous for the young people, really celebrating the things they're accomplishing through their service, hitting that 450-hour mark, earning that award. A lot of great ideas throughout the network that we've seen. Youth Build San Jose in California, when they do graduation, they have a special stole. so that completing your AmeriCorps hours and earning that scholarship almost feels like graduating with honors. And a lot of programs across US have taken that best practice and have started to use it. I think that's really great. Youth Build McLean County in Normal, Illinois, they throw a service prom for their members each year. And that's great too. It's an opportunity for some of the service partners out in the community to thank the young people for what they've done. Not that we're looking for thanks, but our young people deserve some celebration. And a lot of them left school early, and they're not going to have that sort of experience that people who complete high school have going to a prom. So I thought that was a really kind of neat idea that they put that together to celebrate their young people. Youth Build Newark creates giant checks showing off at graduation what that young person has earned for their AmeriCorps Siegel Education Award. That's another great way to recognize at graduation. And then last year we learned in Ogden, Utah, they make progress boards. So as you complete different sections of the program, you get a medallion that you put into a board that you created during your mental toughness orientation. So everybody can see how you're progressing towards your goals, and AmeriCorps is part of that. And that's pretty key and something we really like to see. So yeah, that brings us to the fourth lesson. To have a really impactful and solid culture, it has to be adaptable. And I think we all learned that this past spring. During March and April and May, a lot of programs really thought about how they're going to continue to teach their young people. And I think at this point, we've gotten our feet under us about rethinking education in this online space. And a lot of the things we're going to talk about next week are really about how to reimagine service in a time when we may not be able to be together, or where we have a plan and that plan may change from week to week. So we're not going to talk about that a lot today because obviously that's coming next week. We've got some resources and some ways forward that we've been working on with programs. But also when it comes to culture, thinking about how we can stay connected. When we talk to young people, they really appreciate the togetherness of a Youth Build program and their time in Youth Build AmeriCorps. That family feeling like they're part of a team, feeling like they're part of a movement. How do we preserve that when we're doing it in these little boxes over computers? Well, I think we're still trying to figure that out, but some programs have come up with some pretty cool ideas. So social media, right here on the left-hand side, Project Rebuild is a program in Canton, Ohio that's really good at that. Whatever they're doing, whatever they accomplish, they're putting out there in social media. And that's not always possible for every program, depending on the nature of your parent org and their rules. But I think that's a really great way, not only to show the network or the community or your shareholders, but also for the young people to see what everybody's doing. And hey, this little thing that I'm doing in a small group or as, at home by myself is one small part of a larger thing that's going on. That's pretty neat. Another thing that I got to be a part of this past spring was a game night. So Youth Build Schenectady and my hometown program of Youth Build Troy, they get together every Thursday night and they play trivia, they play Have You Ever, and it's a great way. Again, we were all stuck home, and in some parts of the country we still are. And that can be really tough for our young people. So giving them spaces outside of instruction to get together and have a little spirit decor is really important. Again, Youth Build McLean County, their staff put on Youth Build TV. This is the example we see over here, where each day a different staff member showcases something they're good at or tells or teaches a little lesson that has nothing to do with construction or GED, just to keep that connection going. Another thing that I've really really appreciated during the pandemic is podcasts. I listen to podcasts all the time. And Building Futures, again, they have a great podcast that's run by their Digital Divide members. And at first it was just like, hey, this is our program. Hey, let's meet this staff member. But the last 4 or 5 episodes, the students that are running that podcast have really been talking about how the pandemic has impacted them. And it's really been touching for me. This is my Mow the Lawn podcast. And yeah, it's really great to hear from the young people of Godfrey, Illinois, and hear about their experience. And maybe that's something that, could touch a student at your program. Hey, somebody's having the same experience as me. It's not so different, and maybe I don't feel so alone. So a couple ideas. We're still collecting them as we go along, but yeah, ways to pivot and keep culture going even when we can't be together. And then finally, probably the most youth build lesson of all is empower, engage everybody who's involved. So youth voice, again, going back to Dorothy's example, in East Harlem in the 70s, this all began because of the voice and opinions of young people. And we should be keeping that going. The last couple of years, we did a lot of work around policy councils and how to shore those up and make those better. That resulted in a really great manual with lots of great examples from programs of what they do to keep policy councils going. Member voice is an important way to keep everybody involved. And whether it's a policy council or just having young people involved in the planning and investigation of the service projects they're going to do, that's a lot of what we're going to talk about next week through the framework of service learning. But then also last year, we did some work around making sure that staff have a place and a space for input as well, because their voice is obviously important. And, good ways to supervise and collect that input from your staff. And if you're interested in any of those resources, I could send you that stuff as well. So you can email me directly. So again, 5 lessons when it comes to culture. Have a plan. Make sure that everybody understands and can articulate that plan the way that you intended. Use that tone that you're creating to redefine the expectations of the young people when they come to your program. Be ready to pivot and course correct like we did last spring. And then again, it's not all about us, right? It's not really Youth Build AmeriCorps unless the young person's voice is respected. So making sure that everybody has a place at that table.